Good afternoon and welcome to Pusey House. It's a pleasure to welcome you here. It's a bit of a surprise after a week of such bright sunshine that we've a bit forgotten. Now we seem to have gone back to the matte colors. Yes. My name is George Westaver. I'm the principal here. Great pleasure to welcome Shanti Daffern to speak to us today on Wordsworth and pilgrimage. Shanti first appeared at Pusey House just over 2 years ago as part of Scriptorium. Many of you know Scriptorium, of course, and was doing an MST in 18th century Romantic English literature at the time. Has gone back to Cambridge, to Peterhouse, where she's doing her PhD on Wordsworth, particularly focusing on pilgrimage, on walking and holy places. We're going to benefit from that today. Shanti has also interests in Coleridge and his appreciation of color and the criticism of the Psalms in the 18th century. I find in conversation with Shanti, she has a wonderful capacity to see theological ideas expressed, discovered in literature, or the way in which appreciation of literature enables one to deepen one's appreciation of theological ideas and concepts. And for all those reasons, it's a great pleasure to welcome you here today. We're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. It's a delight to be back here. If you were to read, with assiduity, the weekly update emails from Pusey House sent by Richard the sacristan, you would discover, after headings such as Library and Archive and Recollections talk, a new weekly item number 9, Pusey Pilgrims, Walking Club. We have been, wrote the poet Edmund Blunden in 1942, increasingly on pilgrimage. We are once again increasingly on pilgrimage, wrote Robert Macfarlane in The Old Ways. But he reflects, perhaps though, every age imagines itself to be increasingly on pilgrimage. Every age is a Canterbury pilgrimage, wrote William Blake in 1809 in the descriptive catalogue to his engraving of Chaucer's Pilgrims. Still, the word is certainly thick in the air at present. If last year was the year of walking outdoors, wrote Guy Hayward of the British Pilgrimage Trust in The Guardian at the start of this year, perhaps, and I may be biased, 2021 will be the year for pilgrimages. In this, it seems the Church of England may have precipitated his pronouncement, having already declared 2020 year of pilgrimage, year of cathedrals. Indeed, its discipleship course, launched in 2013, is called simply Pilgrim. It's an intriguing doubling, what we might think of broadly, and there's a lot of nuance to this, as more Catholic and more Protestant poles of approach to pilgrimage, resurfacing and inscribed into the Church's 21st century missional strategies. Nor is this so-called pilgrimage revival just a quirk of the Church of England or secular nature writers in The Guardian. The World Tourism Organization estimated in 2014, which is its most recent data gathering, that 300 to 330 million people each year went on travel for religious reasons, visited the world's key religious sites each year. What's interesting in that statistic, I think, is how often in so many articles and books I've read on pilgrimage that have come out since then, that statistic surfaces instead as 300 to 330 million people go on pilgrimage each year, as though everyone who visits a key religious site is on pilgrimage, and as though people don't go on pilgrimage in other ways. The latter, of course, is not so easy to measure or to define. I'm sure I'm not the first person to suggest that the number of us who go on pilgrimage in some way each year might be 7.9 billion of us instead. In fact, as George Grenier wrote in the International Journal of Religious Tourism and Pilgrimage quite recently, answering any student's legitimate first question, what counts as pilgrimage, is no longer easy. By the end of this talk, I'm hoping I'll have gone at least some way towards answering that question, but less in the way of giving us an easy definition than by opening up new ways of thinking about or looking at pilgrimage through the poetry of Wordsworth. Now, in my earlier plan for this talk, which occupied a couple of sentences, though not the main gist of the abstract you received, I'd planned to spend most of the next 50 minutes looking at Wordsworth's epic poem, The Excursion, which is the subject of the chapter I've been writing most recently of my PhD. The Excursion maps a conversation successively between four characters: the poet, the wanderer, the solitary, and the pastor, also known as the priest. And I'll come back towards the last part of this talk to explore a bit some of the ways in which that conversation, even though it's quite restricted in time and in place, approaches ideas or ways of talking and engaging which are like a pilgrimage. But as I was reflecting on this venue and this audience, I thought that it might also give me license or opportunity to try out and write something slightly different and slightly more exploratory, to think about my PhD as a whole and introduce more broadly the questions I'm considering or surfacing there about pilgrimage itself, and to ask how reading Wordsworth might change our approach to what counts as pilgrimage. Perhaps you'll reject this for being too obvious or too cheesy, said my supervisor when we met towards the end of last week. But if I were you giving that talk, I'd say something really early on about how the PhD itself is a kind of pilgrimage still in progress, and you'd like them to join you on the journey. I decided it was a little obvious or a little cheesy, so I thought I'd let Phil take the flak for that one. In the latter regard, though, I'm also conscious that the majority of you might not have read Wordsworth's poem, The Excursion, or even his slightly better-known autobiographical poem, The Prelude, which he wrote in 1805 originally, but which was only published on his death in 1850. So while I'll be talking about them both, my aim is to do so not in a way that assumes that you also have read them, but invites you into something of the experience of reading them or thinking with them. And I'll say now that by the end of the talk, you still won't have a tidy answer to that question, what counts as pilgrimage? But if any of you head from here, as Father George and I have just done, to the last bookshop in Jericho, or the Oxfam just round the corner, and pick up some Wordsworth, that's the destination I'm aiming for instead. Our interlocutor and terrain will be Wordsworth's poetry, and so in order to start considering that, I want to turn aside straight away to a single poem. This is Stepping Westward on your handout. Composed by Wordsworth in 1805, the same year he was writing The Prelude, which I'll talk about later. It was published first in Poems in 2 volumes in 1807, in a sequence there headed Memorials of a Tour in Scotland, 1803. The poem was printed after a short prose head note from Dorothy's tour journal, which incidentally would then only be published itself in full in 1878 as recollections of that tour. While my fellow traveller and I, the headnote begins, were walking by the side of Loch Kettering one fine evening after sunset, in our road to a hut where in the course of a tour we had been hospitably entertained some weeks before, we met, in one of the loneliest parts of that solitary region, 2 well-dressed women, one of whom said to us by way of greeting, "What? You are stepping westward?" "What? You are stepping westward? Yea, 'twould be a wildish destiny if we who thus together roam in a strange land and far from home were in this place the guests of chance, yet who would stop or fear to advance, though home and shelter he had none with such a sky to lead him on. The dewy ground was dark and cold, behind all gloomy to behold, and stepping westward seemed to be a kind of heavenly destiny. I liked the greeting. 'Twas the sound of something without place or bound, and seemed to give me spiritual right to travel through that region bright. The voice was soft, and she who spake was walking by her native lake. The salutation had to me the very sound of courtesy. Its power was felt, and while my eye was fixed upon the glowing sky, the echo of the voice enwrought a human sweetness with the thought of travelling through the world that lay before me in my endless way. The title of my talk is Wordsworth on Pilgrimage. So the first question we might ask is Wordsworth on pilgrimage in this poem? Wordsworth and Dorothy, the headnote suggests, are on a journey not to a sacred site, but returning to a hut they have already visited. In Dorothy's note, this place prospers the prospect of domestic hospitality, where we'd been hospitably entertained. In Wordsworth's poem, instead, the sense of an immediate geographical destination in place is eclipsed or deferred from the poem's opening. They roam in a strange land far from home. 'Twould be wildish to be the guest of chance, the poet says, but already there's a sense, in particular, that the sky will lead on that traveller in a strange land. And yet, and here we have a very quintessential Wordsworthian negative, there's already that latent threat of stopping, of fearing to advance, of being thwarted in the same journey which will be declared to be an endless way. And stepping westward seemed to be a kind of heavenly destiny. The greeting of the woman, as it's refracted in the poem, opens up this terrain, turning the wildish destiny into something that seemed at least to be a heavenly destiny. It seemed to give me spiritual right to travel, he says. Yet the poet's response is described in terms which, instead of introducing something radically new, merely echo and refract the opening. With such a sky to lead him on becomes, while my eye was fixed upon the glowing sky. They roam in a strange land far from home, yet the right the salutation proffers is not a home to root their journeying in, or somewhere in place, but something without place. It's an ongoing journey, re-understood and renewed, travelling through the world that lay before me. This sense emerges, as I've already indicated, in those repetitions and rhymes of the verse, and if you scan even quickly across your handout, you'll probably notice more instances of the ways in which individual images or word patterns or sound clusters establish that echo of voice across the poem. But it catches echoes outside the poem too. Wordsworth's drawing here on a longer register, and on a register that goes right across his writing. These concluding lines allude to the expulsion from paradise at the close of Milton's Paradise Lost. The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest and providence their guide. They, hand in hand with wandering steps and slow, through Eden took their solitary way, Milton writes. And that Miltonic context almost always comes up somewhere interesting and important when you're reading Wordsworth. Milton was one of his biggest influences, and that same allusion comes again at the start of The Prelude, the autobiographical epic, and also in the prospectus to his Recluse project, the kind of epic superstructure I'm going to be talking about at the end. He explicitly then describes himself as the inheritor of Milton. The tale Milton is telling in Paradise Lost, Wordsworth is picking up and telling in a different way about the world now, the world all before him. In stepping westward, a lot hinges on how we interpret that closing present participle, my endless way. For Jonathan Wordsworth, one of the most influential Wordsworth critics of the 20th century, appropriately, it suggests an endlessly sustained liminal state. Stepping westward, he writes, has become a guarantee of never reaching, and therefore of never sinking into stasis and death, of never needing rebirth. And yet, I think, as that heavenly destiny resituates the wildish destiny, so too does endless way respond to Milton's solitary way. In place of loneliness, there's human sweetness, and the endlessness without place and bound becomes in its own way a kind of heavenly destiny. But neither is it right to read this straightforwardly as a poem, in the words of a different scholar with a kind of opposite view, William Ulmer, about the promise of a Christian afterlife. Instead, within the poem, it's the landscape itself and Wordsworth's encounter in it which is transfigured. It's the world all before them, even if that might unfold a vision of another destiny, what Wordsworth describes in the prelude as gleams like the flashing of a shield. In this, the poem depends implicitly on those ideas of pilgrimage, where ideas of endless wandering, of exile in the world, are held in delicate interplay with the typology of a heavenly home. And I'm thinking there, just as an aside, of, I'll come back to this, but Robert Krause's book, Images of Pilgrimage, which we looked at in a reading group here at Pusey a while ago, has the sort of subheading, wilderness and paradise in Christian spirituality. And here in that wildish and that heavenly, you get that same interplay. At the start of the poem, Stepping Westward, they roam in a strange land and far from home. And I suspect I won't need to overemphasize in this specific room, or chapel, the echoes of the letter to the Hebrews in Wordsworth's phrasing there. Pilgrims, strangers, sojourners all, seeking a homeland. It's not a sheer coincidence either that we get that slight Pauline echo at that point. The most liminal moment of the prelude occurs when Wordsworth crosses the Alps and only realizes in retrospect that he's already overpassed that threshold. It's an episode usually known to scholars as the Simplon Pass episode, and because it occupies a whole chapter of my PhD, if I went into it now, we'd probably still be here when Evensong begins. But in that episode, from disorientation and dislocation, he's lost his way, the poet moves into a paean to the imagination, steeped in the imagery of that same epistle. In the Wordsworth scholar Geoffrey Hartman's words, the passage becomes a descant on the Pauline definition of faith. Our home is in infinitude and only there, Wordsworth writes. So pilgrimage can be redolent too, theologically, of a kind of exile. Post hoc exilium, we will sing in the Salve Regina at evening prayer later. And Sarah Stewart Croker has drawn this out really nicely in her analysis of how pilgrimage works as an image of moral and ascetic formation in Augustine's thought. In that context, she writes, it's critical to retain the sense of bewilderment, of displacement, of alienation and suffering that the term peregrinus, which becomes pilgrimage, suggests. Father George, I thought I'd mention Augustine fairly upfront to head off any difficult Augustine questions later. The interplay makes sense of a certain kind of dynamic in Wordsworth's writing, I want to suggest, between walking as wandering, as roaming, as something displaced and unoriented and vagrant and fugitive, and between walking as purposeful, as homecoming, as seeking, as quest. Betracted amid endless solitudes have shaped him wandering on this quest, So does Wordsworth describe the figure he imagines in a dream at the start of the 5th book of the Prelude, when he's thinking about reading books, and in particular reading books on geometry, and he imagines this figure of an Arab of the Bedouin tribe, have shaped him wandering on this quest. In Stepping Westward, to go back, the prevailing note is tentative. As wildish destiny is couched in the conditional mood, so does the claim of that salutation arrive already twice qualified. Stepping westward seemed to be a kind of heavenly destiny. The salutation is a sound of something and seemed to give me spiritual right. The anthropological interest in pilgrimage, at least, which has really sprung up into a whole field and discipline of its own in the past 20 years or so, and particularly in the last kind of 5 to 10 years, tends to be traced back to Victor and Edith Turner's landmark study, Image and Pilgrimage in Christian Culture. Victor Turner's earlier work had emphasized the study of ritual, and the Turner study characterizes pilgrimage as akin to a rite of passage involving spatial and psychological separation from the habits, the rules, and the boundaries of everyday life, crossing into what they call a liminal time-space, a period neither here nor there, or in between, in their words. I mentioned, I think, something of this liminal quality in Stepping Westward above, and so I introduced the Turners at this point, not only because nodding to their studies become a pretty compulsory early waymark along any journey or book in pilgrimage studies, but because those two most often cited concepts, communitas and liminality, are both so clearly on display and played with in this poem. So I've already talked about this quality of being on the threshold or in between, what Jonathan Wordsworth, who I mentioned earlier, calls Wordsworth's border vision. Now, Jonathan Wordsworth's other book is called The Music of Humanity, and I think that pairs nicely with this idea of communitas, which for the Turners is the spontaneous, boundary-breaking, sudden human connections that arise between pilgrims, or, in their later work, between any participants in a ritual process. The salutation in this poem is the very sound of courtesy. It feels like, perhaps, a moment of communitas. And yet, as critics Lucy Newlin and John Glenninning differently emphasize, the greeting in the poem can also be read in terms of projection or contestation. Wordsworth's poem negotiates, contests, or in Lucy Newlin's more generous reading, enters into an interpretive community with Dorothy's prose journal, as well as with the interlocutor in the poem. And so too have subsequent scholars contested the Turners' conceptual model of pilgrimage. Simon Coleman, John Eade, and Michael Salno, in particular ways and over a really long time, have been sort of beating at this door of emphasizing the importance of contestation, their word, alongside communitas in understanding what happens on a pilgrimage. And there they're talking about the complex, frictive negotiation of competing discourses, priorities, and identities that get forged and merged and complicated by the pilgrimage journey. Do you believe in pilgrimage? Coleman titles his article provocatively. The woman's brief greeting triggers a superfluity of imaginative response in the poet, but it arises in retrospect, that imaginative response, in the imaginative situation of the poem, rather than as it's expressed in mutual conversation. It couldn't have entered at all into an anthropological study of pilgrimage. The echo of the voice enwrought a human sweetness. After the human speaking, that voice had passed by. Nor is the woman a participant in the Turner's terms on this same tour or pilgrimage. She's walking by her native lake, And in some ways, instead, what she's doing here is passing on a knowledge she's gleaned in that locality. It's Wordsworth also is always emphasizing in his own poems on Grasmere and on the lakes more generally, and in his guide to the lakes, the specific and rooted and textured forms of dwelling that come with local attachments too. The local, as much as I'm emphasizing pilgrimage here, matters to Wordsworth profoundly. And one of the ways in which he's reapproaching these issues of what it means to be on pilgrimage is by considering the interplay of locality or dwelling with travel or crossing. Crossing and dwelling, always the two together. Towards the beginning, I mentioned George Greenier's article where he says it's not easy to work out what counts as pilgrimage. As you might guess, despite saying that in the first line, he isn't then daunted to have a very good shot. And the latter part of the article, he gives 7 general suggestions, again drawing more from a kind of anthropology, social sciences, geography paradigm that characterize the experience of pilgrims. And I think they're all really useful to bear in mind when we're reading this poem. First, belief in the transcendent. He talks about that in various ways and across various cultures, but some belief in the transcendent. Memory. Pilgrimage is a journey to recollect, he says, and he describes it as an engine of memory. Time. It is, in his words, timelessness imagined. Pilgrims absent themselves from historical time, he writes, and opt to live temporarily beyond time and its near-horizon perspectives. Fourth, there's an elision of self or an effacement of self, and then accompanying that a higher fellowship or performance without pretense, and there he's quoting again directly from this idea of communitas and authenticity, or at least the urge for authenticity. 6, which I think is perhaps more important, is body-centeredness. This is something that you're doing, if not on foot, then in a way that's very aware of your body moving through space. The physical gesture writ large, he says, and choreographed on a finite terrain, emulates the cosmos. And it's interesting he puts it like that, I think, even in a sort of secular social sciences approach. And 7, incompleteness. Pilgrims, he notes, often feel a letdown on arrival, a sense of transcendence just out of reach. And I think we see and we've picked up on quite a lot of those dynamics coming out in Stepping Westward, this sense of something without place and bound, a journey which is still ongoing, an experience which is important in retrospect, in the memory of writing the poem, but which summons up a kind of timelessness. In a discussion here at Pusey House in the Hood Room once, the chaplain, Father Mark Stafford, who I'm really sad isn't here because if he was here, I would feel much less cheeky for everything I'm about to say, summarized a portion of our discussion, prompted by that book of Robert Krause's, by defining pilgrimage like this: a journey forward with something of the character of continuous arrival. In Stepping Westward, there's this quality of deferment, I want to suggest, which is also a kind of arrival, the way renewed and re-encountered. The way is not only endless, but endlessly already. But in moving forward, it is also, and some of you might guess what I'm going to say next, not yet. I texted Father Mark later that evening to ask if he might give me any citations or support for his observation to integrate into my PhD's footnotes and references. And I got this brilliant reply. What I said was the distillation of 1,000 implications from Jewish and patristic writing and Jewish and Christian liturgies, read by a person, Father Mark, whose own sensibilities have been shaped by Umberto Eco, Derrida et al., my decades of conversation with Taoist priest, fencing master, and being a professional tightrope walker. I fear that's a bit of a moving target, research-wise. A bit of a moving target indeed. But moving targets feel appropriate if we're thinking about walking, about wayfaring, about pilgrimage. Wordsworth's autobiographical epic poem, The Prelude, which I mentioned earlier on, tracks the tale of the poet's life. A traveller I am, Wordsworth writes, and all my tale is of myself. Even so, so be it, if the pure in heart delight to follow me. And thou, he's addressing Coleridge here, O honoured friend, who in my thoughts art ever at my side, uphold as heretofore my fainting steps. It tracks that tale, its broken windings, Wordsworth will write later, or route more circuitous, from his whole life, from infancy to the poem's composition, dwelling especially on his childhood in the lakes, a 4,000-kilometre walking tour he takes across France, Italy, Switzerland and Germany in his last summer vacation at Cambridge, his time at Cambridge, his experience in London, his next trip to France, the despondency he then feels over the development of the French Revolution, and the ways in which that is sort of shaped and inflected and changed when he comes back to the lakes. In his own words, imagination, how impaired and how restored. An implicit register of pilgrimage guides the poem. It shapes the poet's avowed purposes in writing, and the poem's narrative logic in tracing the growth of the poet's mind, the subtitle to the first publication. The poem's explicit references to pilgrimage, and I can talk more about these later, are often self-conscious, uneasy, as though the poet is both attracted by and suspicious of the term's associations with the excesses of the medieval church and the annals in particular of romance. But this implicit register of pilgrimage sits at the heart of the poem. An individual traces the growth of his own mind, tracking his development, including his imaginative, moral, aesthetic, and spiritual development across his life. He treads long journeys on foot, travelling to new regions unknown to him, and revisiting old places in new ways. In certain places, or in certain encounters, he's balked, he says, by silence, by confusion, contestation, or disappointment, in the supreme quality of the experience itself, or in being unable to access an anticipated heightened emotion at a certain spot. Often his imagination, when struck, has an apocalyptic tang, an eschatological vision. On his feet and in his mind, he goes out and he returns. And his journey has a quality, that quality we were speaking of, both of endless arrival and of an arrival endlessly deferred. Arthur pinpoints some of the Prelude's most characteristic and often commented on and distinctive attitudes. We might sensibly dwell on the interplay throughout all of it. I'm thinking particularly of the spots of time, for example, of memory and futurity, the relationship between poetic composition and self-formation, the mediation of the internal and the external, and the prospected marriage, his terms, of mind and nature and God. In journeying forward, the poet retraces also over his past. He visits places where memory has accreted, including graves and consecrated sites, and especially ruined abbeys. And on his way he meets others who guide him on his journey, or towards whom he feels an overwhelming instinct of sympathy or connection. He speaks of sanctity, of grace, of holy places, of centres and spots that hold and attract, of thresholds glimpsed and overpassed, and of journeys or quests into new regions and new inner understandings. He describes himself repeatedly as a wanderer, a traveller, a stranger, and a sojourner, all his words. He is, in short, a pilgrim. In answer to the student's first question, what counts as pilgrimage, we might find something by reading Wordsworth. John Eade, and I'm going to mispronounce this, but Efgenia Messeroutou, in their Oxford Bibliography of Pilgrimage Studies, declare that pilgrimage will be defined minimally as a journey undertaken by people around the world to and from one or more places that they consider to be particularly special or meaningful, as well as the activities they undertake at the destination. For a minimal definition, this is already quite expansive. To and from, they say. How does including the return shape our understanding of what pilgrimage is? One or more places, they say. What difference does it make to think of a pilgrimage not as a linear passage towards a singular destination, but incorporating multiple sites of significance? A journey as well as the activities undertaken at the destination. How might we distinguish between the significance of the journey and the significance of the destination? At the very beginning of this talk, I gave a few examples, just from the sort of popular news in the last few months, of recent discussion on pilgrimage. But just from that, there's already a broad terrain. Edmund Blunden's observation that I opened with, we are increasingly on pilgrimage, hints in his original 1942 essay very much at a condition of being on pilgrimage at that historical moment in time, a condition prevailing or motivating the accompanying ambulatory practice of going on pilgrimage. We see a similar motif in Wordsworth's writing, I've been suggesting, that instinctive overlapping of literal and metaphorical registers. Thus, for example, at the close of the ninth book of the Prelude, in the 1805 edition, which is the first fair copy in manuscript, he writes again to Coleridge, "Thou wilt not languish here, my friend, for whom I travel these dim, uncertain ways. Thou wilt assist me, as a pilgrim gone, in quest of highest truth." When Wordsworth comes to revise these lines for posthumous publication, and there's a whole kind of library of scholarship there about how revision happens in Wordsworth and how that links to these kind of ideas of revisiting literal places. But suffice to say, the Prelude's written in 1805, but he insistently starts revising it. So there's a revised version that comes around kind of 1819, another one which comes in 1833, and then it gets revised again before it's published in 1850. And each version is kind of subtly different. So when he comes to revise them in 1833 for posthumous publication, he excises that passage entirely. But he keeps another register of pilgrimage. Wordsworth and Robert Jones, doing that long tour I mentioned across France and Switzerland and Italy, are brother pilgrims, or in the later revision, social pilgrims, and they return shortening fast our pilgrimage. He also introduces for the first time that epithet pilgrim at the poem's opening. A pilgrim resolute, he describes himself, as he sets out on the road that pointed toward the chosen vale. This sharpens and problematizes a register of spiritual purpose, of vocation, already implicit in the poem's earlier versions, where poetic numbers clothe the poet's spirit singled out, so it seems, for holy services. The imagined role of the pilgrim, though, is contested from this introduction. Keen as a truant or a fugitive, but as a pilgrim, resolute, I took, even with the chance equipment of that hour, the road that pointed toward the chosen vale. The pilgrim emerges there in contradistinction to the truant or the fugitive, but their unlicensed enthusiasm lingers. The chance equipment jostles against the providential register, the chosen vale, which is something that also comes up whenever he's talking about Grasmere in a different poem, Home at Grasmere. And in each case, the assertion of the pilgrim's purposive quest seems held in tension here with the line preceding. In this way, he resituates his pilgrimage, as earlier we saw how he moved from being guest of chance to heavenly destiny. In Johnson's dictionary, which is often a sort of useful source in the period for thinking how these terms are used actually in their kind of original early 1800 context as well. And the fugitive runs from his station or duty like the poet in those early books of the Prelude, who struggles to compose his poem. That whole first book is him reflecting on how difficult it is for him to start the poem, and the only poem he can write is a poem about himself. The truant in Johnson's dictionary is idle, wandering from business, like the poet, who soon lapses back to his pleasant, loitering journey. And Johnson uses the word loitering as well to describe the truant. Where does that leave the pilgrim? If we're going with the usual definition, a journey to a specific place undertaken with spiritual purpose, a pilgrim resolute, there's obviously more than that going on in the Prelude. But in Johnson's dictionary, a pilgrim is also a traveller, a wanderer. Later on in the Prelude, in Home at Grasmere, I am wrong in that note. Later on at Home at Grasmere, Wordsworth describes his brother as a never-resting pilgrim of the sea. The pilgrim resolute and the never-resting pilgrim. Guy Hayward and Robert Macfarlane, again to jump straight back to the beginning and those kind of public ways of talking about pilgrimage, both describe the attraction and the resonance of pilgrimage in this specific moment as operative outside of religious contexts. The Guardian points out that while church attendance is falling, pilgrimage is rising. Hayward speaks of journeys shaped by intention, an intention that might be motivating in an individual, interiorized way, in his words, determined by the heart, as much a matter of reaching a particular, not a matter of going to a particular destination, but something which is determined by the heart, determined by the intention. And Robert Macfarlane also lays stress there on the journey, not the destination, but in a way that I find much more interesting. Pilgrimage should not be imagined, he writes, as a kind of epistemological orienteering, in which one's insights or discoveries are validated at punch points along the route. No knowledge is ideally, in Tim Ingold's fine phrase, grown along the way, an ongoing function of passage through place, both site-specific and motion-sensitive. Because propositions matter, we might say that while on pilgrimage, people think with landscape rather than only about it. His implicit methodology here, it seems to me, is, like Wordsworth's, a kind of literary imagining of what pilgrimage ought to be or ideally can be, not aiming to describe the actual historically situated attitudes that might attend those who go on pilgrimage. It would not map onto plenty of historical accounts of medieval pilgrimage practice, for example. And yet it's so often the situation in Wordsworth's poetry, where time and time again, walking unfolds knowledge and encounter with each step, a poetry grown along the way. A dear delight, he writes in the 12th book of the Prelude, Imagination, How Restored and How Impaired, the same subject continued. It's a snappy title. Discovering his recovery from the despondency of the French Revolution, he says, a dear delight was that of walking on from day to day, where I could meditate in peace, and find the knowledge which I love, and teach the sound of poets' music to strange fields and groves. Converse with men, where if I meet a face, we almost meet a friend, on naked moors with long, long ways before, by cottage bench or wellspring, where the weary traveller rests. In the 4th book, Summer Vacation, he talks similarly about these qualities of restoration in walking. Gently did my soul put off her veil, he writes, and self-transmuted stood, naked as in the presence of her God. As on I walked, a comfort seemed to touch a heart that had not been disconsolate. Strength came where weakness was not known to be, at least not felt, and restoration came like an intruder knocking at the door of unacknowledged weariness. As that fourth book, which is reflecting on the summer vacation from Cambridge back to Grasmere, develops, he describes just one encounter with a discharged soldier. The poet's been walking along a public road at night. Thus did I steal along that silent road, my body from the stillness drinking in a restoration like the calm of sleep, but sweeter far. When, while thus I wandered step by step led on, it chanced a sudden turning of the road presented to my view an uncouth shape. The encounter with the invalided discharged soldier troubles and admonishes Wordsworth, but he leads him to a friend's house, and this, I think, is on the handout. Calling aloud, "My friend, here is a man by sickness overcome. Beneath your roof this night let him find rest, and give him food if food he needs, for he is faint and tired." Wordsworth then entreats the soldier that henceforth he would not linger in the public ways, but ask for timely furtherance and help such as his state required. At this reproof, with the same ghastly mildness in his look, the soldier said, "My trust is in the God of heaven, and in the eye that passes me." And Wordsworth heads back then, after a shared blessing, towards his own home. I draw out that episode because it shows the recurrence of the pattern we were talking about in Stepping Westward, an encounter where a person who brings Wordsworth trouble or admonishment, who stirs up these feelings of religious conviction in surprising ways. But Wordsworth returns then again back to his home. But these are all questions of walking itself. What of the pilgrim's destination? I said earlier that Macfarlane's account of pilgrimage, resistant as it is to punch points of disclosure, emphasizes knowledge grown along the way, that it might not map onto historic scholarship of actual pilgrims. And yet it's often in the historical or theological scholarship of pilgrimage that similar questions come up, are contested or explored. Alexandra Walsham, in the Reformation of Landscape, describes the medieval attitude as incorporating a matrix of points of access to the divine, a network of special places where supernatural power was made manifest to human beings. How we think about holy place influences how we think about pilgrimage. This emphasis on a network of special places, in fact, bears surprising congruence to the approach proposed by human geographers and social scientists Avril Madrell, Alan Terry, and Tim Gale, who advocate for what they call a mobilities turn or new mobilities paradigm in pilgrimage studies, emphasizing the networks, the scapes, and the flows of sacred journeys, which can be seen, in their words, to encompass multiple and intersecting mobilities. Yet for Madrell and Gale, these sacred sites and routes are not fixed and given, but arise from contingent conjunctions at particular points of time and space. And we might think there in the contingent conjunctions of Wordsworth's encounter with the woman as he's walking along, or with the discharged soldier, it chanced a sudden turning of the road, he writes. That feels in a way quite a different proposition from the matrix of medieval holy places that Walsham is describing, what she talks about elsewhere as the localization of the holy. But her study also emphasizes in a different register, under different methodologies, the way in which sanctity is inscribed, contested, and experienced in time and place. In this respect, it's an attempt to think with, rather than just about, landscape, in Macfarlane's terms. A section of my PhD considers how Wordsworth's response to Holy Place situates itself in a self-consciously post-Reformation context, looking to a different poem, The White Doe of Ralston, which is set during the Pilgrimage of Grace and the Catholic Counter-Reformation, as well as his ecclesiastical sonnets, which chart the history of the Church of England. But what I want to emphasize now instead is how very intricate, frictive, and theologically or epistemologically loaded even our uninterrogated assumptions about what pilgrimage is. Protestantism's vocal insistence on the omnipresence of the divine in the world and on the spiritual character of worship, Walsham writes, cannot eclipse the way in which it sacralized spaces of its own. And later on she writes, in this, it may be suggested the sacred was not so much eroded as reconfigured and relocated. The way in which it was present in the world was redefined rather than wholly denied. And so another way in which Wordsworth might help us think about pilgrimage is this pattern, what a different authors talked about as the migrations of the holy, of interrogating at a very particular point in history and in a very particular imaginative context, the ways in which the sacred can be reconfigured and relocated. His poetry has a really deep interest in what we might call spots, the localization of the holy. Jeffrey Hartman writes that he's haunted by the idea of a secret or sacred spot on which nature seemed to converge, that in that he rediscovered the religious and romance motif of numinous places. And at the same time, as we saw in Stepping Westward, there's always this tug towards something unlocatable, what we might think of as, in the words of a sort of different anthropologist, as unlocatable sanctity. Something without place or bound. As place, God, they write, is the origin and locus of the sacred, which is not within the bounds of the cosmos and is essentially unplaceable, something without place or bound. That translates as well, in an interesting way, to bring back again some of the things at the beginning, to what the Church of England is doing in having both a cathedral's year of pilgrimage and a pilgrim project running simultaneously. One seems to be talking about cathedrals as the proper destination of pilgrimage, trying to reseed or encourage across the church the practice of going on pilgrimage in a way which might have been an anathema to Calvin or Luther. At the same time, the idea of pilgrim as a course testifies to a register of pilgrimage as the lifelong discipline and discipleship of the soul, of life's pilgrimage, as Wordsworth writes in The Leech Gatherer. I anticipate a subset of my audience will already be familiar with these lines from the opening of Robert Krause's Images of Pilgrimage. The fundamental and all-encompassing theme of spiritual life is pilgrimage. The theme is all-inclusive and cosmic in dimension. Appropriately enough for Trinity-tide, he continues, in a difficult and profoundly important sense, pilgrimage is the very life of God himself, the Holy Trinity. The very name of God as love bespeaks that timeless pilgrimage of God. What then is man's imaging of God, but a timely imitation of that eternal pilgrimage? What is man's vocation, but the call to take up a pilgrim's way? Irina Widman suggests that despite the emergence of pilgrimage as a topic in anthropological, geographical, and historical scholarship, there's still been a shortage of scholarly attention to biblical and theological aspects of pilgrimage. And so at this moment, I want to sort of aside suggest that you will need a Pusey House theological conference theme for 2025. As Grenier draws out, one of the reasons it's not easy to answer that question, what counts as pilgrimage, is where little irony, due to the emergence of pilgrimage studies as a growing interdisciplinary field. Scholars have to navigate between the twin advantage and liability that it operates under no one disciplinary lens or unified methodology. And alongside this dizzying interdisciplinary array of possibilities, in my own PhD, taken as a whole, I'm attempting two simple, unpromising things. The first is that I'm attempting to read slowly, broadly, not always chronologically, across the works of a single author, in a broadly literary critical bent, even as I occasionally look to draw in these other aspects. The second is that I'm taking as my circumscribed focus or constellation an image, a motif in a tradition which has been implied or glanced towards in almost every critical study I've read of that poet. The unpromising, uncompromising quarry in which I go after seeking my doctorate, or the originality and contribution to scholarship implied, is of course the poetry of Wordsworth and Pilgrimage. There's a quality in much of Wordsworth's poetry, and which Wordsworth himself relishes, of aiming not for originality of insight, but of convincing his readers to feel, know, or notice things they knew already. This is the same thought that De Quincey articulates in his 1845 essay on Wordsworth's poetry. He describes Wordsworth's power as truth, which suddenly strengthens into solemnity an impression very feebly acknowledged before. The author who rivets notice the most, he says, is not he that perplexes men by truths drawn from the fountains of absolute novelty, but he that awakens into illuminated consciousness old lineaments of truth long slumbering in the mind. That's an inversion of a sideswipe that Coleridge takes in a letter of the 5th of April 1815 addressed to Lady Beaumont, which is that Wordsworth takes a very long time to convince himself of truths long accepted as commonplace by the majority of everyone else. But having at last convinced himself, he finds them, or he believes them to be vision, not platitude. Lady Beaumont and her husband, Sir George, were friends and patrons of Wordsworth and Coleridge, who they live with on and off in this period. Coleridge writes, "I've sometimes fancied it that having, by the conjoined operation of his own experiences, feelings and reason, himself convinced himself of truths, which the generality of persons have either taken for granted from their infancy, or at least adopted in early life, he has attached all their own depth and weight to doctrines and words which come almost as truisms or commonplaces to others." In that letter, Wordsworth's point is not a compliment. He is taking as his point of aim Wordsworth's epic poem, The Excursion, which I mentioned at the very beginning, and so this is also your clue that I'm heading towards the end. The Excursion disappointed Coleridge. This is a period, in the words of Kenneth Johnston, when Wordsworth and Coleridge addressed themselves in public with veiled private attacks only the other would understand. One of the reasons Coleridge is disappointed in The Excursion is that The Excursion is promised, or is the pledge of, a broader project which Coleridge and Wordsworth worked on together, the project which is the superstructure, so to speak, of my PhD. This is the Recluse project, a poem which Coleridge writes of in the Biographia as having planned to be the first genuine philosophical poem, a poem that was meant to take account of man, of nature, of society, or as Coleridge writes in another earlier letter, the mind, the nature, and God. Almost every letter that they write about the Excursion and the Recluse project covers almost every imaginable subject. They're going to progress from how society ought to be organized, into how men ought to speak, into how people respond to nature, into how upbringing and education should happen, and in all of it, they will express philosophy, they will express theology, they will give a sense of man, of nature, of God. And so the other way that we might think about Coleridge's point is, what are the things that Wordsworth is doing that are trying not only to convince himself, but to convince us of truths which for us might feel like commonplaces, but which to him have come to be experienced as vision. On Monday this week, when I'd already prepared most of this talk, I was reading Abba by Evelyn Underhill, which is a series of meditations she has on the Lord's Prayer. And I noticed at the very beginning of that, she quotes, in reflecting on why we would read and reread the Lord's Prayer, or pray and repray the Lord's Prayer, a very similar point, and she quotes again Coleridge, this time from Table Talk. It's the most useful prerogative of genius to rescue truths from the neglect caused by the very circumstance of their universal admission. Truths of all others the most awful and interesting are too often considered so true that they lose the power of truth and lie bedridden in the dormitory of the soul. Quit your couch, as the character of the Wanderer urges the solitary in Book 4 of the Excursion. Rise early, climb the hill, give chase to the wild goat and the red deer, be adventurous with the bee, and return wearied and sink at evening into sound repose. It's a tall order for every day. And yet, in the Excursion and in the Prelude, which appropriately we focused on because Wordsworth talks about it as the portico, or literally the prelude to the Excursion, we see a way in which, by thinking about pilgrimage and by thinking about walking, inhabiting place, glimpsing vision or sanctity, Wordsworth is trying to urge us to quit your couch, to rescue truths often considered so true. And one of those I want to suggest is that Wordsworth is a poet who has something very particular to say about pilgrimage. Wordsworth himself never helped matters when it comes to entertaining new readers to entertain the Excursion. In the preface, and that's the last thing on your handout, from its first publication in 1814, he declares the poem that follows to be the middle portion of this otherwise unpublished, never finished gargantuan Recluse, the Excursion being a proportion of the Recluse round the title page until 1832. Even when he dropped that subtitle for the next edition in 1837, the preface and its ambition of expectation was retained. The attentive reader would one day perceive, Wordsworth declares, that the Prelude stood in the same kind of relation to the Recluse project entire as the antechapel has to the body of the Gothic church, were all Wordsworth's other works as little cells and oratories. It's quite a gauntlet to affix to a poem already 9,000 lines long that a truly attentive reader ought to progress into it via one epic poem, then still unpublished, the Prelude, which we've been progressing into today, and then into another epic poem, never to be written, the meditative first portion of the Recluse, which was to be an epic as long as the Excursion. And then, when finally standing in that counterfactual Gothic church, to look around and to discern the connections across to all of Wordsworth's other shorter pieces, beating the attentive pilgrim's path to as many side altars and sepulchral recesses of verse. This is an invitation into a sort of sanctum of poetry, which is, shall we say, not only inaccessible or not exactly inaccessible, but wily. George Herbert's Temple makes a similar claim for pilgrim readers, but that claim is for reading 160 lyric poems, while Wordsworth's daunting gauntlet depends on around 30,000 to 45,000, depending on your count, lines of verse. And critical opinion has tended to agree, perhaps for that reason, that taking seriously this image of the whole of Wordsworth's poetry as a kind of Gothic church is a generally pompous move on the poet's part, as the editors of the prose works write. But I want to suggest also, and to leave on this note, that there's something in that image of this structure, a structure which is unfinished, which is incomplete. Hazlitt observes it will be like one of those stupendous but half-finished structures which have been suffered to moulder into decay. which also at the same time is very appropriate for a poet who delights in the overgrowing of ruins, who hallows incompleteness. It's a useful reminder to take seriously the ways in which Wordsworth's poetry unfolds narrative journeys within itself and interconnections across its texts. And today we've looked only at one sepulchral recess, stepping westward. In that respect, the invitation to enter a Gothic church is not just a bravura analogy, but points towards an integral concern, towards reading as a kind of pilgrimage.
Thank you, Shanti. That was fascinating and a wonderful expression of thinking. I'm thinking partly approaching this through a theological lens, but finding this incredibly rich in terms of helping me both to understand Wordsworth, but also the idea of pilgrimage. So I'd like to start with a question, then we can open up questions. We have some time. People are also joining us online, which is why we have a microphone here, and a microphone Dr. Price will hand around. Dr. Price is here for the first time in person at one of our Recollection lectures, having been very involved in helping to organize Recollection lectures from the Warsaw Annex of Pusey House. It's very good to have him here in person. He began his role as a lay academic fellow in mid-lockdown last November, or late October. He'll pass around the microphone, and the microphone has the purpose not to amplify sound in here, but so that people online will be able to hear the questions as well as the answer. Shanti, you, in one of your descriptions of definitions of pilgrimage, drawing on, I forget the name of the author, with seven points, but referred to a belief in transcendence as being a part of that as Wordsworth, but also an emphasis on memory and recollection. And I was wondering how those two interact in the sense, is one is journeying towards something that transcends experience, transcends knowledge, but what does it transcend and what do we find? But is that what we find coming from our memory? How do those two interact? Are we finding something radically new? Is it what populates that transcendence? How does it relate to our memory? I guess I'm trying to think of these two things. We're arriving somewhere beyond, but part of the way we arrive there is through what we have in our memory. I'm wondering how those two interact in terms of what we find or what we're looking for. How does it relate to what we're recovering from our memory in Wordsworth? And I'll move out of the way now.
Ooh, do I have to now come back to the microphone? Okay, sorry. So, in the prelude, as an example, a lot of the spots of time that he talks about are moments that he has experienced or encountered in a particular way. But then in remembering them in the poem, he discovers a kind of richness or a depth to that experience. So you have, for example, the very kind of famous, obvious example of daffodils, where he's talking about recollection in tranquility, and that image of the daffodil only works because he's recollecting it afterwards. And so you get things like a trip he makes to, just thinking about sanctity as well, to Furness Abbey or St. Mary's Pile, as he talks about it in an early book, where he describes this experience of hearing a bird sing in the abbey, and he says, "I would stay forever to hear such music." So you have this sort of sense of timelessness, or of something in that specific spot. He talks about it as hallowed ground, where he is accessing this kind of sanctity. But then it's later on in the book, he then describes again the experience of going round and round this abbey, St. Mary's Pile, as he hears, or just after he hears, that Robespierre has been executed. And his experience then, inflected by the French Revolution, is a very different experience of that same place. But in both places he uses this word of threshold. And there's this sense that the place has given him, if we're thinking about transcendence, something which is beyond the immediate moment, the bird singing in Furness Abbey isn't just a bird, it's a glimpse of something that would make him want to stay forever. When he's writing about the French Revolution, he says, it's something like, all of my life felt like it had been on the self-same path. Now a threshold was overpassed, and it would be different thereafter. That's why I brought my Wordsworth earlier, so that you weren't subject to that level of quotation. But then you also get an interesting, so you have those kind of moments where what memory is doing is it's changing the kind of sanctity experienced. But then you also have moments where memory itself has a sacralizing character. And that's something that happens particularly in the Excursion, where what happens in those later books, when these four characters get together, is they go to a churchyard, and the priest, or the pastor is the one who's kind of accumulated these stories, tells the stories of the different people in the graveyard. And there it's like the act of remembering each of their stories is also something that's imbuing the spot with what they variously call sanctity, consecrated ground, etc. But that only emerges through the telling of the stories. In Home at Grasmere, when he's talking about his kind of local vicar's churchyard, he talks about that incommunicable sanctity which time and nature only can bestow. So I guess that sort of jumped around a lot of places. So I think there's a way in which memory for Wordsworth is always an imaginative power. So in things like his preface to his 1815 poems instead of his preface to the Excursion, he talks about memory itself as a really key ingredient to writing poetry. And memory isn't just remembering, but it's imaginatively transfusing. And there's something similar to that with what's going on in these holy sites, in that they're both spots of time or of memory, and they're actual places that have this kind of transfusion. Then there's memory as a kind of communal remembering that you see in the Excursion, or he talks in the prelude also of the community, the one society on earth, the noble living and the noble dead, and there's this sense of a connection between the living and the dead in memory. But you also have, the last thing I'll say is you have moments where it really jolts against each other. So in the Simplon Pass, for example, it's the fact that he can't remember exactly or got lost or remembers the experience of getting lost that suddenly pushes him into this glimpse of transcendence.
I realize I've been a bit selfish
Sorry.
because, no, we don't have it's quarter past. We have somewhere between 5 and 7 minutes of possible questions. So, shorter questions, shorter answers. And, I mean, this is my long-winded question. I apologize.
Sorry.
Joy.
Is this working? Good. This is a simple question. You mentioned the Recluse project, and that sounded rather grand and like it wasn't finished. So I wondered if you could say a bit more about that.
Say more about the Recluse project.
Yeah. The thing I mentioned quite at the end, which was appropriately incomplete. So it's a project that sort of dominates in for a long period of Wordsworth's writing what he thinks he's doing, not always what he is doing, but he thinks he's trying to write this three-part tripartite epic which covers all of these topics I mentioned. And every time again it's another kind of image of thwarting or finding things difficult, every time he tries to write it, he seems to break off or to not write it. So he says in a lot of letters, I'm getting on with the Recluse project will be finished soon. And then he doesn't. So he publishes things like poems in 2 volumes instead, which I mentioned, those 1807 poems. He writes in a phase where he's just promised to Coleridge that he's going to write an epic poem. And so one of the questions is that is meant to be a kind of first-person meditation on all of these topics. And why does Wordsworth find that hard to write? And how do those things show up elsewhere? So, for example, the time when he breaks off from it most deliberately is, and maybe this actually goes back to memory and sanctity as well, is a time when he's trying to write about this churchyard in Grasmere, the kind of time and incommunicable sanctity churchyard and the destruction of that churchyard. And then from there he jumps fairly randomly to writing about St. Basil and Gregory of Nazianzen and their correspondence and this kind of idea of monastic retreat or monastic solitude. He talks about a kind of a community gathered and gathered in memory as well and gathered across time and undissolving fellowship. But then instead of dwelling on that, he suddenly writes about the destruction or the imagined destruction of the Grand Chartreuse, the kind of primary Cistercian monastery. And after that, it breaks off as writing, and he doesn't return to the Recluse project properly. There's this long period, well, a few years where he stops writing it. He writes some prose works on sort of what's going on politically, and then he comes back and he writes the Excursion. And he brings in some of the things that come up in the Grand Chartreuse episode. So some of those ideas about what monastic solitude is suddenly find themselves in the mouth of the solitary, and an atheist who's we're meant to not take seriously what he thinks about monastic solitude, but they've originated from a context where Wordsworth's actually incredibly pro-monasticism in that poem. So it all has this kind of odd in-between moving context. And then eventually, I mean, the short end of the story is the Excursion gets terrible reviews, which we haven't really touched on, and it puts him off continuing it, if indeed he was ever going to continue it. He never does, and that is the end of the Recluse project. So these two epics he promises to write, he never writes. And eventually, sort of 60, 70 years into his life, people have learnt not to ask him, how is the Recluse project going on?
One more question, please.
Something of a lack, something of a dearth in like pilgrimage analysis from a theological, biblical standpoint. So I was wondering what you think is the connection, if any, between Christian pilgrimage, which seems to have a positive connotation, and desert wandering in the Old Testament, which seems to have a negative, maybe punitive connotation.
Can I just check, so what the theological connotation is between kind of the idea of desert wandering as a kind of pilgrimage and the idea of kind of exile as a kind of pilgrimage? Or
holy thing versus desert wandering, which was a punishment in the Old Testament. Yeah.
So I think I would say firstly that there is some good scholarship. I think there's a sense there could be even more, but so there's a book called Explorations in a Christian Idea of Pilgrimage, which is, I think it's a couple of years old now, but which has a sort of chapter on lots of different really interesting bits, all of which kind of end in like a chapter on the Eucharist as a way of thinking about pilgrimage, ends with like, would someone write more about sacramental pilgrimage, for example? So it is out there, is the first thing I wanted to say. I think I would say I'm not a theologian, and so I wouldn't want to wildly speculate in case I would be wildly wrong. But my sense would be that also one of the things that's operating in that is, and I guess I kind of got at this with the sort of unlocatable sanctity ideas as well, is the suspicion in the very early church, as I understand it, of also wanting to understand Christ or Jesus or the Christian pilgrimage as something distinct from other ways of thinking about pilgrimage at the time. So you might have that kind of quality of wandering, but one of the reasons that becomes integrated or becomes important is for someone like Augustine generally, broad overstatement with someone to check here, you are also trying to think about how that pilgrimage that you're doing can be a pilgrimage in and with the person of Christ, rather than a pilgrimage to an actual place. And that actual place isn't kind of magic or compulsory to visit, but you're trying to understand how all the ways you visit those places might integrate into this broader sense of making yourself more like the pilgrim who is Christ, who is the way.
fascinating talk, taking questions, really interesting and helpful, really very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now we're going to magically transform the chapel for Evensong and Mass at 5:30. Yes, why don't you say something about it? Please, come to the microphone.
So just yesterday we confirmed, we had theologians in contract law with Professor Wim de Kock. That will need to be moved to Michaelmas term because of travel restrictions. He won't be able to come over from Belgium without quarantine. So that will still happen in the Michaelmas term, along with John Finnis's Recollection lecture on the centrality of the Gospel of Mark. But in week 8, we've gotten Dominic Burbage of the Canterbury Institute and St. Peter's College on recalling the university to the covenant, the place of theology in knowing. And so I encourage you to come out for that. He's a very good thinker, very good on epistemology, virtue ethics, and whatnot, and a young person to watch in Oxford who's doing very good things. Dominic Burbage, Wednesday of 8th week, I believe that's the 16th of June.